I'm going to speak today on a subject that is on the borderline of a range of different disciplines, philosophy, economics, and political theory. And what I'd like to do is begin by saying two things which I'm going to use later on, but I wanted to present them first and exploit them later in an argument that I want to make about the nature of alienation and how it figures in understanding our political lives and social lives. The first claim I will make, I will not argue for. In fact, I'm going to argue for it tomorrow when I speak in a lecture which is a tribute to Amitabh on his retirement, amongst others, Kulkarni and Pradhan as well. So I won't argue for it, but I'm just going to present it to you. And it's a philosophical proposal or philosophical claim or proposition, which I will somewhat dogmatically just assert right now. We can discuss it during the discussion if you like, and I'll be speaking more about it tomorrow. And then I will present a dialectic about political ideals, and having done that, I will then proceed with the basic historical and conceptual argument I want to give. So the first proposition I want to put down is that values are not something that we generate through our subjective selves, but values are part of the world, including nature. That values are properties of nature and the world. And this claim goes against a long tradition that you find in Hume, David Hume and Adam Smith and many others, which is that we generate values through our desires and our moral sentiments and so on. So I am going to deny that. I'm going to say values are objective properties in the world to which our subjectivities or agency responds. And this goes against a certain conception of nature in the world, for instance, which is widely assumed and propagandized by figures like Richard Dawkins and others, who all claim that the concept of nature must be understood as that which the natural sciences study. That's a definition of nature which is emerged sometime in the 17th century, which defines nature as that which is exclusively studied by the natural sciences. Now, if you take values to be properties in nature and the world, then that proposition that nature has full coverage of natural science is false, because natural sciences do not study values. So I believe it is a superstition of modernity to say that nature is exhaustively studied by the natural sciences. And my reason primarily for thinking so is, it's not as if I myself am an atheist, so it's not as if I oppose Dawkins on that, but I think it is a philosophical, it's a grotesque philosophical fallacy to claim that nature should be defined exclusively as that which the natural sciences study. And my reason for opposing it is because I think that values are in nature and the world. Okay, so that's one claim which I will exploit later. I want to now move to setting up a discussion on some political ideals that have become very central for all of us who live in liberal democratic societies such as India, and though I don't know for how long. And it's a set of ideals that have emerged in the political enlightenment of Europe, and have been adopted by many parts of the world. And they were sloganized at the time of the great revolutionary developments in France in the 18th century in the form of ideals that we have come now to cherish and make central to our polities. That is the ideals of liberty and equality. Now, these two great ideals, which we all admire, it is very strange that as soon as they were articulated in the 18th century, they began to be theoretically developed in such a way that they were seen to be in an irresolvable tension with one another. So it's a very perverse thing that a grand philosophical and political movement such as the Enlightenment should articulate two ideals and then immediately develop them in methodological and theoretical terms such that they could never be jointly implemented, that you only pursued one at the cost of pursuing the other. And this tension, of course, became crude and spectacular in the rhetoric of the Cold War, when one side accused the other of pursuing liberty at the cost of equality, and the other side accused the other of pursuing equality at the cost of liberty. And that's just a very crude political manifestation of theoretical developments, which made them deeply opposed to one another, or at odds with one another. So one of the things we all should be considering and asking is, how is it that we have accepted a tradition of thought, such as the Enlightenment political tradition, in which two ideals which we all admire greatly cannot be pursued together and are in tension with one another in that tradition of thinking? And I think, so let me give you a very brief sense of the source of the tension between these two ideals. So one source is very well known, so I'll just mention it and move on because I want to talk about it later. But one source is been much discussed, and of course Marx made it very central to his thinking, and that is that liberty was theorized in such a way that it was bestowed on people by the fact of the possession of property. That is, the possession of property bestowed on the possessors of property a certain liberty, which became enshrined in the laws of the land. Right? And that is an obvious and very widely discussed source of inequality. So that's one obvious source, and it's so well known that I won't mention anything more about it. The other source, I think, is in a way psychologically deeper, and that is that, well, I don't know what the best expression for it is, but what I've called it in some of my writing is the incentivization of talent, of individual talent. You see, in many social worlds for many centuries, when there was some excellence in some work or production, no individual was praised for it. The praise went to the whole zeitgeist. Sometime, well, it's impossible to put a date on this, but only relatively recently, if you take the large sweep of history, it was only relatively recently that it began to be felt that this was to deny individual liberty. If you didn't praise and allow individuals who produced the work to be the recipients of praise and reward, right? So, because it was considered a deprivation of individual agency and liberty if you said that the zeitgeist has to be praised for the excellence of particular productions, right? Because it would then be that individuals would be just considered to be embodied personifications of the zeitgeist. And that seems to be depriving them of genuine individuality. So concepts of desert emerged and began to be theorized within the notion of liberty. And you had the right to reap the rewards of your individual talent and its productions. And this, of course, creates great inequalities as well. And, just think of the many examples of it. You have merit raises in jobs, you have sportsmen getting endorsements and prizes, writers getting prizes, on Wall Street, it was after the crisis when everybody said, let's cut the bonuses of these investors, investment bankers. There was an outcry saying that the banking industry will lose its talent if you cut the bonuses. To which the obvious answer is that if the talent got us into the financial crisis, then maybe we should have some mediocrity. So there was this there's this general tendency to incentivize talent as a liberty, as the right of people to the desert of their individual talent, and this leads to inequalities as well. So these are just two. I've just mentioned two very well understood reasons why liberty began to be theorized in such a way that it came to be at odds with equality. So in my work, what I've tried to do is to say, this is intolerable. It's intolerable that you should have a philosophy, a political philosophy, in which you have two great ideals, but you can't see them as being compatible. So what I've been doing in my work in recent years is to say, let's just usher these two ideals off center stage. Just remove them from the centrality that they've had for the last 200-300 years. And what I've proposed is that we should find a third ideal, which is even more fundamental than liberty and equality, and put that on center stage, and then bring back liberty and equality, as it were, from the back door, but now only and merely as necessary conditions for this more fundamental ideal. And what I've argued is that if you do this, there may be a chance that liberty and equality will not be in tension with one another. So that's been an effort to reorient the political concepts that we've inherited from the Enlightenment. But that does mean, if you do that, what it does mean is that you're not going to present a political philosophy that is, as it were, a continuation or an improvement of the Enlightenment political philosophy, but rather you have changed the meanings of liberty and equality. Because now, if they're merely necessary conditions for a more fundamental ideal, then their meanings would have changed. And then the hope is, with these revised meanings, they could perhaps be compatible with one another. That's been my methodological proposal. Now, this is very much like what Thomas Kuhn said in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions about sciences, right? What he said is that the concept of mass does not mean the same thing in Newtonian mechanics as it does, say, in modern physics, Einstein's physics, let's say. And so that's what I'm trying to propose. That is, we should change the meanings of liberty and equality. And the method by which we change the meanings is to no longer have them on center stage, but see them as merely necessary conditions for something else that's on center stage. So what is that other more fundamental concept? And my view has been appealing to both Marx, but the early Marx, and the so-called early Marx, and Gandhi. My view has been that the more central ideal we should emphasize is the ideal of an unalienated life, a life without alienation, which should be, I think, the most fundamental goal of politics. And not liberty and equality, but liberty and equality should be seen as necessary conditions for achieving this other more fundamental ideal. Right? Okay, so those are the two background points that I wanted to make. The first about values being part of the world around us, and the unalienated life replacing liberty and equality, and reorienting our understanding, therefore, of liberty and equality. Okay, so now I'm going to come to the main line of thinking and argument that I wanted to present in this lecture. You know, it's a very interesting thing that a lot of people have said and assumed that what happened in Europe, say in early and mid-modernity, must happen elsewhere in the world. This is a widely assumed teleology. What happens in Europe will happen everywhere else in the world, in due course. Let me give you, if you think that this is just a sort of grand philosophical claim but doesn't really have any effect in our real lives, well, let me quote to you what Professor Amartya Sen said when all this trouble was going on about Singur and these eminent domain taking over dispossession of people in order to give corporations land for their productions, for profit and so on. Amartya Sen said, when there was a lot of protest about this, Amartya Sen said, England, in an article in the Financial Times, he said, England suffered its pain in order to create its Londons and Manchesters. India will have to do so too. Right. Now, this is Amartya Sen, one of the most humane economists in India. Just the assumption that what happened in Europe is got to happen here. Of course, this is as others have pointed out, as Professor Prabhat Patnaik, the economist, has pointed out, this is a very strange way of pursuing a historical analogy because it leaves out the most important historical context, which is that when people were dispossessed of their land to create Londons and Manchesters, they migrated in thousands and thousands to over the Atlantic to America, whereas there's no place for the poor of rural Bengal to go except in the glutted metropoles of the country because of immigration laws. They cannot go to any other place. But nevertheless, what my reason for pointing this out is that somebody like Professor Sen just simply assumes that what happens in Europe must happen in other parts of the world. As a philosopher, what interests me is not just the claim that these are sort of laws of necessity, of economic necessity, but that the argument for them has always been that what happened in Europe must happen elsewhere in the world, because what happened in Europe was a rational thing to have happened. You see, when you justify all sorts of things like conquest and so on and so forth, you have to give reasons for doing it. People don't just say, I want to conquer it because I'm greedy and I just want to exploit these other lands. They have to give loftier reasons for it, and the loftier reasons are, we want to bring rationality and so on to these lands. So the general tendency of this teleology has been, because what happened in Europe had a rational justification and foundation and basis, it will happen elsewhere in the world. Right? So it's not just laws of economic necessity, etc., but a claim to rationality. Right? That these are moral and political achievements that Europe underwent, and it therefore should happen in other parts of the world. Well, let's look at which theories said that some of these developments, like private property and so on, was a rational thing to have happened. The very things that make liberty at odds with equality. So let's look at the theories and arguments which claimed that what happened in Europe, that to make us understand liberty, say along these lines, was a rational thing to have happened. So the theory which does this most forcefully, and its originator was a man of great intellect. The theory which does this most forcefully first was came to be called social contract theory. And this social contract theory has had many manifestations, but the one I'm interested in, I'm going to focus on, is due to John Locke. And Locke claimed that, well, what is a social contract theory? Let me explain to you very briefly what the idea of a social contract theory is. The idea is that people are merely people until they implicitly agree on certain principles to live by, which is sometimes called a contract. Right? So people are merely people until they agree on certain principles to live by as a convention or a contract. And when they agree to this, they suddenly become something more than merely people. They become citizens. And the situation they were in as people gets transformed from a state of nature to a polity. Right? So when some people exist as merely people, they are in a state of nature. They then agree by consensus to certain principles to live by, implicitly. Nobody actually had such an agreement, but implicitly it is claimed that people agreed to certain principles to live by in a state of nature, thereby converting the state of nature into a polity and converting themselves from being merely people to citizens. And Locke's claim is that this is a rational outcome if two conditions are met. First, that the consensus should be uncoerced, should be freely given to these principles. And second, if the principles that they come to a consensus about in a contract, if living by those principles make them better off than they were in the state of nature, then it's a rational outcome. So two conditions have to be met. They're better off as a result of the contract than they were in the state of nature, and they're choosing the contract or the principles to live by must be freely chosen. The consensus should be freely given. Okay, so those are the two conditions for it being a rational outcome. Now, what was the historical context in which this was done? Well, let's look at Locke's argument. So what Locke says in the Second Treatise on Government, where this famous theory is first propounded, is that, so he says, imagine a scenario which is a state of nature. Imagine that we are in this state of nature, merely people in this condition. And imagine that some of us find stretches of land. Few of us individuals find stretches of land, and we fence it. Each one of us fences it. And we register that fenced land in some small office, some bureau which we set up for registering it. And so the land for each of us becomes our land. It's possessed by us. And then for those who are not possessors of this land through this means, we hire them for wages to work on the land for us. And the claim is that if everybody's better off as a result of this, we as possessors of land, some of us, others as working on the land for wages, if all of us are better off than we were in the state of nature, then this is a rational compact. So, if it would be rational for the non-possessors, the wage earners, to agree to this because they are better off than they were in the state of nature, and of course the possessors of land are better off than they were in the state of nature. So it's all in all a rational thing to have agreed on. It's what sometimes is called a Pareto improvement of one's conditions. Pareto improvement is a term that economists use, which really just means that nobody's worse off and several, perhaps all, are better off. Right? But nobody's worse off. Okay, so now this is the claim, and this claim about the social contract as a rational outcome, this claim is presented as in a certain historical context. Now, what was that historical context in which this was claimed to have happened by Locke? Well, the historical context in which Locke was writing was a context in which a lot of land, very extensively, was the commons. By the way, and that's exactly what the commons are here. All this controversy around forest land and the Adivasis and so on is basically the same issue as existed in the time of Locke, right? Which is that there were, before Locke, enclosures, what was called the enclosures movement. People were just taking over the lands and dispossessing people, right? And they were doing it by brute force. And what Locke was doing, the point of the social contract, the historical point of the social contract, was to make this seem like a political and moral achievement, to make enclosures, the taking over of land and dispossessing people of it for what we would now call agribusiness, was, it was a primitive form of agribusiness, not quite as sophisticated as it is now. That was going on by brute force, and what Locke's social contract theory made it possible was to say that this can be done as a right, because it's the rational way to make our social arrangements. So if you wanted to know what was the point and rationale of the social contract theory as Locke propounded it, it was to give a rationalization for a process that existed before Locke, which was the enclosures movement. Now, what is interesting is, now many of you may have read that in Marx's Capital, in chapter 27 of Capital, Marx writes with great passion and anger about the enclosures movement and what it was doing to the commons and people who just worked on the commons. But what's fascinating is that in the 17th century, so let's focus on England particularly, because Locke's from England. What existed in England at the time was a very remarkable dissenting tradition who were opposed to the enclosures. And these were people well before Locke. So a great political thinker before Locke and activist was somebody called Gerard Winstanley, who was the leader of a movement called the Diggers. But there were all sorts of dissenting groups. The Diggers was just one of them. There was the Levelers, the Ranters, and these figures. So let's just take Winstanley as a good example of this. Winstanley protested in very similar terms to many of the things that Marx said. This enclosures of the land and dispossession of people. So what I want to do is to put a certain counter-argument against Locke's argument, which I've just presented, in the mouth of Winstanley. Okay? I mean, it's completely anachronistic ploy on my part because Winstanley predated Locke, but so he was trying to, let's say, preempt Locke's argument with this argument which I'm now going to attribute to him. So Winstanley could be, the dissent against the enclosures could be on the basis of the following possible counter-argument. So here's Winstanley speaking. Winstanley might say, look, I agree with what Locke is saying, that if you did this, people would be better off than they were in the state of nature. But that's not the right question to ask. Are they better off than they were in the state of nature? Because the way Locke has set things up has an opportunity cost. How many of you know what an opportunity cost is? Any economists here? All right, so it's a very simple idea. The idea is simply, the idea of an opportunity cost, it's very simple. Don't get put off by the jargon. The idea of an opportunity cost is that if you make a choice, then one of the things that happens, one of the costs of making a choice, is that a certain benefit which you could have had is avoided. Right? So some choices we make cancel out possible benefits we could have had, and that's a cost you pay for making the choice. Okay? So Winstanley could be seen as saying to Locke, look, it's true what you say, that we are better off than we were in the state of nature, but we are not better off than we would have been if you had not privatized the land in the first place and left it as a commons. Right? If you hadn't privatized the land and we had worked the land in a collective commons, if we worked it in much the same way, say that Gandhi said we should work on ashrams or just collective cultivation of a common land, right? What we call cooperatives here, and so on. So if we had done that instead of privatizing the land, then you're right. By doing what you suggested we do, we are better off than in the state of nature. But we're not better off if we had done this instead. Right? This would have been better than what happened due to the privatization of the land. So now that is a counterfactual argument. And what Winstanley could be saying is, look, I don't agree to your notion of consent. You say we've consented to the arrangements that exist now. Actually, they exist right now, all around us, right? But I want to say there's another notion of consent to something which in fact did not obtain, which is the collective cultivation of the commons rather than privatization of land. Now, this puts into doubt what Locke's outcome is, which is that this is rational, because it would have been more rational not to privatize the land, according to Winstanley. Now, how would one argue against that? Well, Locke did not respond to this because nobody said this in Locke's time. Right? This is an argument I'm giving on the behalf of Locke's imagined interlocutors. But there has been in recent liberal political theorizing a new argument which, as it were, updates and fortifies Locke's social contract theory. And it's an argument that all of you should really read, because it is very much the way, very much underlying of the kind of mentality and thinking that goes into liberal political theory that underlies modern society, modern agrarian society, and indeed modern capitalist industrial society. And liberalism and modern capitalism, including its agrarian remnants, are very much part of a single way of thinking. Liberal doctrine is very much goes hand in hand with capitalist political economy. So here is the updating of Locke's argument, which will provide an answer to this counter-argument that I've attributed to Winstanley. And it's known as the argument from the tragedy of the commons. And it's very widespread. I mean, the argument was propounded in a very famous paper by a man called Harden, but it's just part of how everybody thinks. And it's a perfectly straightforward argument. Now, you shouldn't be put off because I'm going to introduce another bit of jargon, but these are all fancy words that academic professionals use in order to terrify you as if something difficult is going on, but it's actually perfectly simple and easy for anybody to understand. And the tragedy of the commons argument is based on what is known as a multi-person prisoner's dilemma. So just don't be put off by that. It's the simplest possible thought. Here's the argument, and this is what a multi-person prisoner's dilemma is. The idea is that if there is a commons which we all collectively, say, cultivate, it could be anything. It could be fishing in the ocean, right? The fresh air that we breathe, or just pastoral land that we graze on, cultivate for agriculture, and so on. These are just standard parts of our lives. To this day, when we talk of the environment and fresh air and so on, fresh air is the commons. And they say the internet is a cognitive commons. Anybody can, appeal without paying, have access to it, and so on. So fresh air, maybe the deliverances of the internet in our time, but the common land that was lived on and collectively cultivated before privatization took place, which is very extensive in the time that Locke was writing, and is still there in the forest regions of many indigenous societies, including here. So, so what is the tragedy of the commons argument? The argument is this. Its conclusion is, it is never rational to cooperate in a collectivity in a commonly owned land or other resource. It is never rational to cooperate. For individuals to cooperate in the collective cultivation of any common resource, such as land or fresh air or whatever, is not rational. Here is why. Because we are all in a multi-person prisoner's dilemma. We are all in a situation in which if everybody pays a certain cost, everybody gains. If each individual pays a certain cost, all individuals gain. That is absolutely true. But if somebody refuses to pay the cost, which is known as a free rider, if somebody refuses to pay the cost, he or she will gain all that he or she gains by not paying the cost, right? For herself or himself. The cost to others will be distributed over everybody. And it's rational for them to not pay the cost because they don't know that others are paying the cost. Right? So if we are in a group in which we're collectively cultivating the commons, I don't know that you're going to pay the cost you're supposed to pay. Sometimes the cost is restraining yourself. So, you shouldn't overfish, you shouldn't over cultivate because you can destroy the land. So sometimes you have to stop cultivating, etc. But these are all costs people pay. So each individual thinks like this in the multi-person prisoners dilemma. They say, what if I pay the cost, but somebody else doesn't pay the cost? Then I will lose and they will gain. And I never know that they have paid the cost. How do I know that they have paid the cost? For all I know, they haven't paid the cost. So if I don't pay the cost, I will certainly gain by not paying it. It will be costless for me. I wouldn't have paid the cost. And what do I care if they do it or not? But if everybody thinks like that, there's the tragedy of the commons, because the commons will be destroyed. Right? So the argument is we should privatize the land and do what Locke said. Hire some should be possessors, others should be hired for wages. That's much the more rational outcome. Right? Because the idea of a collective cultivation of the commons is dependent on every individual cooperating. But this form of thinking says it's never rational for the individual to cooperate because they're in the epistemic dark about whether others are cooperating or not. Right? And if they cooperate and pay the cost and others don't, they will lose terribly. So might as well not be a cooperator. Okay? It's rational not to be a cooperator. But if everybody is rational, then there's a tragedy of the commons, because the commons will be destroyed. So, given that it's rational to not cooperate, and it has this tragic outcome, the best thing to do is to do what Locke said, just to privatize the land and forget about cooperation in the commons. It becomes an individualistic economy. Just the kind of things that I was saying lead to the tension with equality. Okay, so that's the mentality underlying it. Now, what's very interesting here is that there are lots of people, including, alas, Noam Chomsky, whom I greatly admire. He himself says that this, and the great economist who won a Nobel Prize, Elinor Ostrom, who died since winning it a few years ago, also argues that you should not read the tragedy of the commons argument, or that paper by Harden, as arguing for a privatized economy. Rather, what they are showing is, what the argument shows is, that we should set up an efficient and competent way of policing and punishing non-cooperation. Right? So Ostrom points out that it's a misunderstanding of Harden's paper to see it as an argument for the tragedy of the commons argument as an argument for privatization. Rather, what Chomsky and Ostrom and others say, that it is a way of in fact, saying that no, we should have the commons and collectively cultivate it and punish and police and punish non-cooperation, the free rider. Well, I'm afraid I think that just doesn't dig deep enough into what is wrong with the argument. It's just completely unsatisfactory way of responding to it. Much as I admire both Ostrom and Chomsky, I think it's a shallow response to the argument. And the reason for this is very simple. The reason is that what underlies the tragedy of the commons argument is a certain way of thinking. It's a mentality. And if you retain that mentality and hope to police and punish the exercise of that mentality, which recommends non-cooperation. What's going to happen is that the problem will arise one step up with the idea of policing and punishment. Because why should we cooperate with policing and punishment? Why should I not bribe the policeman? Why should I not make mafia-style threats to anybody who tries to police and punish me? Why should I not change the laws, as corporations constantly do, so that I can get away with things? Right? So the idea that we should cooperate with policing and punishment is a form of cooperation about which you can raise the same question. Right? You can undermine the cooperation needed to police and punish. So, I mean, just standard examples. Somebody, who's brought in as a witness to say that you have been a non-cooperator, you threaten the witness with setting some gundas on them or something. It's just it happens everywhere, right? It's pervasive. So, and that is just basically repeating the non-cooperative mentality one step up. So you have non-cooperation, which is rational at the level of collective cultivation. You can have non-cooperation by what Chomsky and Ostrom and all want, which is policing and punishment. And you can undermine that as a result. And it's widely undermined, all sorts of places. And corporations are the masters of undermining it. So what should one do if that's just a shallow tinkering solution which retains the mentality? So what I wanted to argue for you here today is that we have to rethink the mentality that's involved. We have to refuse the mentality that's going on here. All right, so that's what I want to argue, and now I want to go back to what I said about liberty and equality and the unalienated life. Because what I want to claim is that it's the ideal of being unalienated which opposes this mentality, which gives rise to, the mentality gives rise to a notion of liberty that puts us at odds with equality, and you have to resist it at the level of the deepest level, which is to present one with an alternative way of thinking, which is what I'm going to describe as the unalienated. So look, I have said that liberty and equality are in tension with one another. And I have said that we should replace it with this idea instead, and see these as necessary conditions for this. Right? These are not on center stage anymore, as they are in the doctrine of the Enlightenment. Now, what is fascinating in intellectual history is that this idea has always been said to have been exemplified in pre-modernity. Alienation, according to Marx and Rousseau and others, but including Marx, has been said to be a malaise of modernity, of the last 200-300 years. That in an earlier time, however defective those societies were, the defects of what we crudely call feudalism, in pre-modernity, however defective those societies were, they didn't have the defect of alienation. They had this, according to Marx. So Marx claimed that there was a sense of belonging that people had in an earlier time, even if they suffered greatly in other ways. And they suffered by a lack of this and this. Right? But they had this. Now, what I'm trying to do in my work is to say, this cannot be the unalienated life of pre-modernity if this and this are necessary conditions for it, because this and this were lacking in pre-modernity. So what I'm really doing is trying to transform all three concepts at once. I'm not presenting this as the old ideal at all. Right? So what I've done is I've said I want to change our understanding of this and this by making this central and this merely necessary conditions for it. But if these become necessary conditions for it, this can't be the old concept because this was lacking in pre-modernity. Right? So this has to be changed from the old concept, and these have to be changed from the Enlightenment concept. So I'm looking for a triangular transformation of all three concepts. That's the political, theoretical thought that I'm pursuing. And what I've argued is that certain ways of developing this along the lines of property that I've been describing, etc., give rise to this tension. So, there's the culprit here which sets all this problem going. It starts there. It's the fault line, is to have a conception of liberty that creates the tension with equality. That's what sets things going. And I've described some of the mentality involved in the discussion of property and the arguments for it and the incentivization of talent. So we have to ask that the hook to make this triangular transformation is to see what we can do first to reorient the notion of liberty from how we've inherited that concept. And liberty is understood as basically the most basic point about liberty is that it's individual self-governance. And I think you can't leave the individual out. I'm enough of a liberal to think that you can't leave the individual out of any equation in political theory. So we need a notion of liberty which is individual self-governance, which is what liberty has to be, otherwise it's not liberty. It has to be individual self-governance. But the question I want to ask in order to make this triangular transformation of all three concepts is, can we have a concept of individual liberty, of individual self-governance, that is non-individualistically conceived? I'm not interested in collective liberty, whatever that means. Okay? I'm interested in individual liberty. And I'm asking, is there a way of philosophically, theoretically developing the notion of individual liberty along non-individualistic lines? Because that would be the beginning of how to get that triangle, move through all three sides of that triangle. So what would that be? How would one do that? It's a really hard challenge. And here I want to go back to give you a sense of what I mean by individual liberty, non-individualistically conceived. I want to go back to the first thought I presented to you, which is that when we think of values, we are thinking of things in the world, properties in the world. What makes values properties in the world? How are they different from the other properties in the world? Remember, when I started off, I said, if values are properties in the world, they are different from the properties in the world which the natural sciences studies, because natural sciences don't study values. Okay. So the Ganges River has H2O, which is what the natural sciences study, but the Ganges River has value. And natural sciences don't study value. So I'm saying nature has more than what the natural sciences study. This goes against Dawkins and everybody else. So So, and the world around us generally has value, but what is it to be a property that is not what the properties that the natural sciences study are? Well, it has to be a property that makes normative demands on it. What these special properties are, which the natural sciences don't study. The properties that natural sciences study are properties that we just simply, in a detached way, explain and predict. But value properties, values, is not something we have that detached attitude towards us because they trigger our agency, our practical agency. So they make normative demands on us. If you were to want to metaphorize, they would say, do this, you ought to do this, you ought to do that. But you have to see the world right, because I'm claiming that the normative demands come from the layout of the world. So you have to see the world correctly. And my idea here is that you have to see the world from an orientation that is not just yours. When you're looking at the world and the normative demands that the values in the world make on you, you have to see the world. It's a point in phenomenology, actually. You have to see the world not just from your own point of view, but from everyone's point of view. You have to just literally see the demands in that way. Let me give you an example. Actually, this is a bodily example. It's not a social example, but I want to give you a sense of why this phenomenology is really crucial for me. So this is an anecdote, which is how I began to first think about this. I was teaching my daughter to drive a car. She was sitting next to me, and I, in America, sit on this side. So she was sitting next to me, and I was explaining things to her, and I noticed that when I was talking to her, my orientation to her, my bodily orientation to her, was my individual body looking at her. Right? My orientation to the world was me and my individual body looking at her. And then I noticed that when I turned around to drive the car, to show how to drive, my orientation to the world was not from the point of view of my individual body, but from the point of view of the car. If I had started driving by having the same orientation on the world as I had when I was looking and talking to her, when I was driving, I would crash the car. I literally would have had to take on a view and orientation on the world which was larger than my individual view and orientation on the world. It had to be from the point of view of the car. Because if I'd just done it from my own point of view, I would have had an accident, been a car crash. So you have to take on a larger point of view in seeing and navigating the world. And I'm saying, I've just given you a bodily example. We need a social version of that. Not a bodily version of it. We need a social version of seeing what the demands of the world are from a larger point of view than ours. And my thought here is that if you have that, you could not even raise the question of the tragedy of the commons. Because if you had that, the question, what if somebody else didn't pay the cost and I paid the cost, that question would not so much as arise. The ideal of an unalienated life just simply cancels the possibility of the mentality that underlies the tragedy of the commons. So the ideal of an unalienated life is the ideal which makes possible a conception of individual liberty which would not allow it to be at odds with equality. Because you could not raise the kinds of questions that give rise to the tension with equality, which is there in the whole tradition from John Locke down to current ways of thinking of Homo economicus. Right? So let me just conclude with a story that some of you may have read in something I published, which I think illustrates what I have in mind by the assumption of an unalienated life. And that is, some of you have read it. I think Amitabh must have read it. In my early paper on Gandhi, written in the 90s, I give the example of once when I was a kid. I think I was 12 years old. I used to live in Bombay, and I used to, at that time, Cuff Parade, which is near which we lived, was a beach. It's now like Manhattan. It's got skyscrapers in every square yard. So my father and I used to go for long walks in the morning when I was a kid, and we were walking on the beach, and we came across a wallet which was lying on the beach, some rupees sticking out of it, and my father stopped us grandly and said, "Akeel, why should we not take that?" And I was a kid. I said, I think we should take it. And he said, why should we take it? And I said, well, if we don't take it, somebody else will take it. So let's take it. And he looked cross, but then suddenly his expression changed. I have a vivid memory of this. His expression changed, and he looked very lofty, not angry at all. And he said, I had said, if we don't take it, somebody else will. And he said, if we don't take it, nobody else will. Well, that's the idea of an unalienated life. That's the mentality of unalienatedness. And that should be the primary goal of politics. If it were, you would have a notion of liberty that is constructible, which is not at odds with equality. And I believe it is what Marx and Gandhi and Hegel before Marx were trying to figure out. And I've tried to present it in a different context with a different conceptual history. Thank you very much.